Okay, welcome back. We're now into the third week of our CISSP study session, where we're going to hopefully give you a whole lot more material that you could use to learn everything you need to know to go through these different domains. So at the end of this, we're of course going to get everything you need for this exam, and well, hopefully you'll be able to take it and pass. So let's get going. So we've got our normal class information, all the stuff about Master of Security, all this stuff I'll flick through, and I'm still me. So, overview. What we're going to do is make sure that you get what you put in out of this. So everything's there on the MOOC. If you don't already know about that, if you've joined in later or you're watching this on YouTube, then there's a MOOC site as well. So learn.itmasters.edu.au. Now, there are lots of different areas of material about this class that we're using that we're going to be pulling together. Some are mine, external sites, everything, and we're doing it as much as possible so that it's without cost. So let's look at security principles. Three main areas, and I'll harp on this one every week: availability, integrity, confidentiality, and we have to really understand each and every one of these. It is all about understanding how systems fit together. This is what we're trying to do. So we're going to start our first area this week, if you've already had a look on the learning site, is law, investigations, and ethics. And this is one area I've had a lot of work with. I was the author for the official guide for the management stream, the ISSMP, and the law, investigation, and ethics bit for ISC². So I have a little bit of knowledge, and I've also written a whole lot of the questions in the past for this area. So if you don't like them, you get to blame me, because I've got a lot of input into this particular field, mainly because I've actually got a law degree as well, and all that stuff. So external sites, a little bit of reading here. We have CCQA and a couple others have a little bit of info that give you some insight into law, investigations, and ethics. Now, I've said this before, don't worry too much about which particular domain it actually says, whether it's 6, 8, 10, whatever else. It changes over time. The actual material is fairly much the same, even when they move it around every now and again. So, legal investigations, compliance, and investigations. Why do we care about this? Now, computers are just a tool. At the end of the day, they haven't really brought anything new in. I know we've got this idea that they have, and people think we need special computer crime laws and all these other bits and pieces that become interesting. But the reality is there is practically nothing that existed, well, legally before computers that has popped up because of them. No, that's a big claim, and many people don't like that one. But the reality of the fact is, it's true. There isn't really anything there. What we do have, of course, are different ways of doing the same sorts of things. So, over time, well, we take where we've been. We look at, for instance, theft, fraud, and all these other things, and computers make that easier. They don't change it. They don't make it a new thing that hasn't been there before. They simplify it. So simplification is what has really occurred. Now, what do we care about here? Well, it's really there to control things so that we can ensure that we can, well, stop the bad guys doing things against us, make companies have minimum standards, everything like that. So it's really about, like everything else, acting ethically, acting in a correct way, and staying within laws. So we have RFC 1082, ISC Code of Ethics, etc., and all of these give us a set of guidelines. We're going to cover some of these throughout this particular session, and we really need to understand and know what these are if we're going to do well. So what we're looking at here, what things we can and can't do, what is okay as a CISSP, etc., and, well, what we need to think about doing. We have different types of legal systems, This is one area I've had a lot of experience with, both in this and outside. I also teach law apart from IT, and common law, civil law, customary law, religious law, and mixed law are the major types of legal systems we find around. And the reality is we don't really have one of those anymore. What we have is a amalgamation of them, so mixed systems. Civil law, and there's a little bit of confusion here, of course, because we have civil law, as in being in, say, the Australian or American system. We have a criminal and civil system. Now, when we're talking about a civil system, we're not talking about civil law. We're talking about the individual, not the state, being able to take action in a court. It's still a common law system, but using a civilian system. So the law is civil law, or common law in that case. So when we're talking about civil law, it's the Romanesque Napoleonic code type thing. It's codified. And we have some of that even here in places like Australia and the US. When we basically put through legislation and dictate and mandate how things are going to occur, what we're doing is codifying. So that type of law is well, really the prevalence of how some systems like France work. So what we're trying to do is set, this is what you can do in a framework. That's a little bit different than other things such as common law, which I'll get to in a moment. Customary law, these are the values of society. So society as a whole, what it allows, does, etc. The traditions, any wisdom, whatever else that is handed down. Example being, we have customary law here in Australia with Aboriginal groups who act within tribal law. So tribal law is a type of customary law. There's religious and canon law, so that in the Vatican, or Sharia law, where jurists and clerics are really the central aspect of it. So not man-made, decreed by divine will, or at least that's how it's believed. Mixed law is really what practically everyone's now in. It's the blending of multiple systems. So as the world becomes more and more globalized, we find something like common plus codified law, religious law plus, etc., etc. So at the end of the day, we have multiple aspects of all of this that are blended into, well, one unified whole. So that's what we're looking at there. More and more, that's what we're going to find. Now, we also have intellectual property laws within all these different systems. These are things like patent, trademark, copyright, trade secrets, and licensing. So all of these, of course, have other bits and pieces that they fit in with. We need to understand a little bit about intellectual property law, because a lot of what we're going to be really protecting our systems against is going to be intellectual property. Data we're holding, the copyrights over our systems, theft of data, espionage, etc. is all an intellectual property crime. So when we're talking about someone breaking into our system or a computer attack, we've got to remember it's not really a computer attack. We're looking in general terms, what we're looking at in reality is someone breaking in for theft or espionage terms. I mean, so patents, we have a variety of time. There's no such thing, first of all, as an international patent. People get that wrong. What we really have is a series with WIPO, W-I-P-O, of international filings. So when you file with WIPO in what people call an international patent, you're filing your one patent in up to, say, 100 plus different countries around the world, and it's a different patent in each one. So if you want to take action and you want to sue someone for breaching your patent, you have to do it everywhere. So it's really about protecting novel, useful, non-obvious inventions, which includes all sorts of things: breeder rights for plants, mechanical items, algorithms, etc. We also have trademark. I'm sure everyone's seen the registered symbol, the R in a circle. So that's for a registered trademark. But you gain a trademark even without having to register it. Now, these are what is your brand, how you differentiate yourself from others out there. It's really any symbol, names, whatever else that allows you to think of your business as your business. So really protecting a market, a brand, whatever else. So if you think, we have many brands out there. We have McDonald's and IKEA and Coke and Pepsi, and all of these, they're really a way of differentiating themselves so that people can't misapply what's out there and say, oh, that cheapy brand of cola, oh, I didn't realize it wasn't Coke, that sort of thing. We have copyright. This is any expression of an idea. So as an example, by doing this course, there's copyright. There is a protected open whatever else type license. But what we're doing at the same time is we're licensing it so that anyone can effectively use it. And so even then we still have copyright. We're just saying that anyone can freely use that copyright without paying us money. So in most countries, copyright is automatic. It automatically goes against something. Now, that means you write something and it's there. What people don't understand, though, is quite often you have to actually register to enforce it. So in the US, for instance, you have to go to the Library of Congress and register your copyright if you want to be able to enforce it. But you can do that at any stage. So copyright is a weaker protection, 75 years. Varies. There's also a few moratoriums on what's happened there. Trade secret, proprietary information. Now, you need to take steps to protect trade secrets. These are things such as your sales list, your vendor list, your products, your recipes, formulas, algorithms, and whatever else that you haven't patented and made public. They last forever as long as they're protected. So things like you sign non-disclosure agreements, all that sort of stuff. Secret recipe, whatever you're doing in a business, someone can't take that and leave with it and start something else in a similar organization in another place. If they do, then that's where they can get into trouble. They can be, basically, well, you can sue them for breach, whatever else. This is where you see all these things about someone left the company and, well, this was a problem. So, you sign a non-disclosure, you're protected for it. If you don't protect your systems and it gets out into the wide world, then once that occurs, you lose trade secret. Anything that becomes public, you lose. We also have licensing. So illegal use of software, whatever else. So we have 4 different categories of licenses: freeware, shareware, commercial, and academic. And mainly these are done under master agreements and EULAs. So this is really how I can use, how I can install things. Now, we have a question there. What is the legal position of governments, e.g. buying hacks and exploits? What is the legal position of being the vendor in such a transaction? Well, that's going to really come down to a particular organization or particular set of laws. GPL, General Public License, is a type of freeware. So what you're saying, missing GPL is an implication, a particular way of having a freeware license. So GPL is just a freeware. Open source is still a freeware license. From a legal point of view, it's still freeware. You can argue you think it's different, but a lawyer's going to basically look at you and say it's freeware. You're not charging necessarily. So are you charging? Are you semi-charging, offering for whatever else like shareware? Is it a commercial use or is it an academic license? So generally when you're talking about the other, it's a freeware license. Now, legal position of governments, well, it comes down to the individual government law. There's nothing stopping a government from buying exploits. If their laws say they can buy exploits, they can. Legal position being vendor, well, again, depends on whether it's telling you that it's allowable or not. The laws are going to vary. But if you're selling to the Americans or something like that, then there's nothing wrong with it legally. On the other hand, if you're breaking controls, such as encryption controls to get into a product, then you might be in breach of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, but that's a different issue. And what is a EULA? E-U-L-A, End User Licensing Agreement. So when you get something from Microsoft and you install it yourself, that's a EULA, End User Licensing Agreement. Other things we need to look at, we have to consider privacy issues, rights and obligations of all those individuals that are in our organization, outside our organization, whatever else. We have a balance between all these things, horizontal and vertical enactment, whether we're doing it across industries, whether we're doing it regulating things like financial industry regulations, etc. EULA is one of the reasons I run Linux. Well, there are still EULAs on Linux too. If you consider that Oracle have Oracle Linux, and Oracle is, well, commercial. So just because it's on Linux doesn't mean that you don't get EULAs. You also have other commercial software runs on Linux. So SAS, for instance, is one reason there. Okay, so privacy is also considered a major issue in to many different governments, pieces of legislation, etc. So we have a United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, US Privacy Act, etc. Some of these things go a little bit far. Personally, for instance, human rights in United Nations, that declared in Europe that internet access is a human right. Food isn't, but internet access is. I mean, yes, I like internet, but I prefer to eat and drink. So we get a bit wacky with some of these things at times. We have different issues. So the OECD, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, has a number of guidelines, basically collection quality, what you're using it for, how you're accountable, all of this stuff. At the end of the day, how you set up what you're doing is important. Why you're doing it, and making sure that people know. Now, it's quite common for people to actually complain after they've clicked through and said, yes, I agree for Facebook to use whatever and all that stuff. But if you don't read and you want to still use things, you may have accepted the use. A common one is if you go to Facebook and you set up an account, most people don't realize that they own all your data. They can do whatever they want with it fairly much. They can troll it, go through it, sell it to the NSA, give it to the NSA, whatever else. So you have a right to privacy on your own systems. But when you're using other people's systems, you need to make sure that you look at the contract and the license agreement that you're signing up to. We have to also consider privacy in the workplace, employee monitoring, email, and personally identifiable information. Now, but don't you think the company makes the privacy term super long? Maybe they don't even want users to have patience to read through it. Well, part of this isn't the company, it's the legal system that we're in. Now, unfortunately, if you make a nice short, we're going to do this, you end up in a world of trouble if it goes to court. So you have to define what you're going to do, and lawyers get involved, and it makes life tough. The requirements for legislation, with COPA in the US, with all the safe harbor acts, with everything else, make it harder and harder. And you take what should be a one-page document, and because of regulations and legislation, you turn it into a 100-page document. That's what we do with all of these things. We also have liability. Company does not practice due care in trying to protect itself from computer crime. It can be found liable to be negligent and, well, at the end of the day, can suffer damages. So liability is really something based on a negligence action. So another question, should I locate a server or register a domain in Europe, even if I used the US, if Europe is more rigorous about privacy? Whose law applies? Oh, that's a difficult one. You've got jurisdiction there, and maybe it depends on where it's backed up. where they can access whatever else. If you want to truly be private, then make sure that you protect your own server. The end of the day, nothing in America stops you from setting up your own web server and encrypting your own data, even as it is on your disk. Nothing at all. If you use Facebook, you put up with Facebook's policies. If you use Google, you put up with Google's policies. That's the whole thing. So it's whoever they say it applies with. Not so much your domain or anything like this. What are you doing to protect your information? So we also need to think about the core concepts here: due diligence, due care, and the legal fiction, prudent person rule. That person who is rational and understands what they're doing and make sure that they go out there and do things correctly. So what about privacy and PRISM? Doesn't it breach Australia law that the NSA intercepts upstream traffic of all major IT service companies, Google, Facebook, etc., encrypting data actually flags the data for later decryption? All right, 2 points. 1, the Americans cannot decrypt your information. That simple. PRISM does not decrypt anything. PRISM looks at metadata. So it's not reading anything inside things. Forget all that anyway. At the end of the day, they can't decrypt it either. If you have an SSL cert running, they are not decrypting it. The entire set of big machines, including the SGI ones, the Sun ones, the HPI systems, whatever else in the NSA, given about 100 years, could not decrypt any SSL. Now, saying ISPs have SSL interception enabled on the proxies, no, they don't. That you can tell. Okay, the first thing is they're going to actually flag. You can always tell. You will see the ISP cert. When you click and check, you will see your ISP certificate. If you go to China, you might see an ISP certificate there. But if you're getting the digital certificate from Microsoft, then the ISP has not intercepted you. Forget that myth. They can request private keys from those major companies, but that doesn't mean that they will. So if you're talking about that, that also means saving session keys, which, if you think about the crypto bit, having public-private, you need to also have that stored for the session. And most companies don't do that. So it's not as, I mean, there's a lot of hype around this, but it's nowhere near as much. Contrary to what people think, the NSA does not have half the capabilities that we like to espouse to them. All right, computer crime. Computers are the target of criminals, and this is part of why we talk about turning things over. And why do companies turn things over? Well, they can. Read the statement. If you put something up on Facebook, it is public information. Even if you have private groups and whatever else, it is not private. You have no contract with Facebook. You are not paying Facebook to protect your information. Consideration is part of a contract. So you are using a public server and putting things there. If you want, you can always get your own machine. You can create your own Exchange server, your own Linux server. You can stick it up there, and then you can have a protected system that the government has to ask you about. Computer crime is really growing because there are no boundaries, no borders, no anything else. Domestic laws are the problem here. Adding more laws isn't going to make this any better, contrary to what people think. We can start pumping out laws till we go red in the face, and it will not slow down cybercrime, because it is not about domestic laws. It's really about the international jurisdiction and the ability to easily hide data. It's the lack of people who are actually able to do these things. Now, this is where you're talking about the NSA and other things. I can tell you now that approximately 1 in every 100,000 domestic computer crime cases gets investigated. And that's at using all the cops and everything like that to their fullest extent for what we have. 1 in about 100,000. That's the figures from Australia or US. So if you think the NSA is looking at all your data or you're worried about all this stuff, the reality is there is so little of it actually occurring. I mean, there is so much happening out there that we can't get to it. This is our big problem. There is so much computer crime. Every second of the day there is another computer crime happening because it's easy. Now, from a company point of view, this is where we can start to investigate. We have digital forensics. We can start to deal with evidence in our system. We can create models, how we're going to collect evidence, how we're going to examine what we present. And forensics, at the end of the day, what it basically means is something we present in court. Nothing really difficult. When we're taking digital forensics, what we're doing is saying we're presenting digital, computerized, whatever else, evidence into court. So that's what digital forensics means. So computer forensics, digital forensics, we're starting crime scene. We want to protect our environment, where people have got into, whatever else, find the evidence that's there, any potential sources, collect it, and minimize contamination. 5 rules. Needs to be authentic, accurate, complete, convincing, and admissible. And chain of custody does matter. So, chain of evidence is a technical detective control. Now, the chain of evidence is ensuring that we have a control over the evidence we've collected from end to end. So, the investigator comes in, they sign the piece of paper saying that they did this hard drive. They hand it to someone else and get a signature so that we know where the evidence has been at all times. It helps us ensure when we go to court we can say that this is authentic, that it hasn't been updated, changed, or whatever else. Some of that actually becomes simpler when we're talking about IT, because if we're talking about a hashed database, if we have the original hash stored somewhere, we've sent multiple emails out to different people so that we can't spoof and say that it's something else after we've changed things. Even if we lost the hard drive and found it later, we can run the hash again and say it hasn't changed. So there's actually a little bit of leeway in digital evidence that people don't seem to think about. Incident response is part of all this. Incident response may or may not lead to actually going into court. Sometimes we just respond to an incident and move on. We may get a virus, we may get something else, and that's it. So what it's really about, detecting a problem, determining the cause, minimizing the damage, resolving, and documenting for future reference. So ZDNet there, how the NSA and your boss can intercept and break SSL. Yes, people can, but this is what I'm saying. If you have a look at that little certificate down the bottom of your machine, then they're going to actually see your interception. So there are many ways to break SSL. I keep saying this, but all you need to do is check whether it's working. You can check the certificate. Yeah, they show the padlock sign, but padlock sign is not security. You're supposed to check that padlock. Have you actually clicked on it and looked at where the certificate is? Have you used that little green bar at the top and seen who the certificate thing is from? If you're just trusting the padlock, then you're not actually you're not securing your browser. If you want to go to your bank and you want to ensure these things, then you need to make sure that you have validated this. Isn't it enough just checking if there's a HTTPS and the lock? No. What if the CA is compromised? That's a big one. If you have a trusted CA and they get compromised, then if you trust that CA, then you're compromised. This is why, as well, when you get your browser, don't accept default settings. This is where people go wrong. You have something like 50 different CAs listed in your browser. At the moment, there are ones from, if you download Mozilla, there can be ones from China and Iran and whatever else, all loaded there. Don't trust them. Go through and look at which ones you trust. Don't just say because there's a browser plug-in there, you have to use it. So you should go out there and say, I trust VeriSign or not, because they sell things. Diginotar, well, I never got done by Diginotar because I never trusted them. I go through and I have 5 different CA certificates in my browser that I'll trust. All the others I delete out. And if I need a particular one, I add it when I need it. It's a bit of extra work, but it allows you to go through these things. So goals of incident response, we're trying to minimize the damage that has been done. So after someone's already got on, and remember I keep saying this one, you can never make a perfectly secure system. All you can do is capture and minimize the damage that has occurred. So that's what we're trying to do, minimize the damage. We need a response capability. These are the people who come in there and, well, basically go through and fix everything up. They will find that you've got a virus on your system, find out how it's getting out there, what it's doing, analyze any traffic that's being sent in and out, how it got onto your computer, and fix the problem. We need to have a combination of different areas for this. It's not just IT. It is about having partly an IT team, but also anyone else who needs to be part of the response capability. Maybe media, maybe legal, etc. So different models, virtual teams, permanent teams, hybrid teams. And what we're really trying to do is triage and react. So incident response and handling, we're going there methodologically. Triage, what is the biggest problem? Investigation, what happened? Containment, stop it spreading. So we're really stopping the bleeding. Find out what happened. Recovery, sew up the wound, so to speak. And then learn from it, debrief feedback. So any reasons for these CAs being in the browser default in the first place? Yes, just make it easier. So rather than people having to go out there and download particular trusted CAs, we just add them all. So it takes effort for people to go out there and find CAs. So rather than being a list of them, we just add them all. Should you do forensics in-house or get a firm that specializes? Yes. It depends on your organization, however. So forensics, if you're big enough, if you've got the capability, if you can afford it, and you have enough incidents to make it worthwhile, in-house. Otherwise, specialize. All a risk type function. All right, code of ethics. There is the Protect Society, act honorably, provide diligent and competent service, advance and, well, protect the profession. Remember, this is a professional certification. It's really about making sure that we follow professional aspects of how we react. So we need to make sure that we act ethically. And there's no one way of saying what is ethical. There's no you are ethical, I'm not, that sort of thing. There are different aspects to ethical behavior, and we need to understand how these work. At the end of the day, it needs to be something you can justify based on these sort of canons. I'm protecting society. Some people can argue that being a whistleblower is protecting society. Others will say that it's not, etc. It depends on the individual case. So it's not hard and fast. Ethics is not like law. Okay, types of computer crimes, things you need to think about. Denial of service, breaking someone's whatever so they can't get in. Theft, eavesdropping, social engineering, illegal content, material pornography, child porn, all that stuff. Fraud, embezzlement, software piracy, dumpster diving, malicious code, spoofing IP addresses, information warfare, espionage, destruction of evidence, data modification, terrorism, and masquerading. All of these things are types of crimes. Now, so let's look at the different categories of law. I mentioned that you had the civil law system of places like France based on the Roman law. Now, there's also a different part of it in that, well, criminal law, civil law, and administrative or regulative law are really the different aspects of common law, just to make things a little more confusing. Criminal law, those things that are punished generally by the state, what we know as a crime. Civil law, contract, tort, wrongs against an individual taken by an individual, and administrative or regulatory law, things done by the court for the court's reasons, government agencies, that sort of thing. What is dumpster diving? A quick question. Well, that's someone going into that locked paper thing out the back and searching for documents, passwords, etc. So used to have some friends of mine who used to do that a lot, trying to find passwords. They'd go through the dumped papers of an organization and see what they could find. Remember, intellectual property law. We have patent, copyright, trade secret, and trademark, and you need to understand each of these. I've also put in, there'll be loaded some papers up here for reading, one of which is a messy version of my master's thesis, in my master's in law thesis, because this is what it was basically about, or getting close to a decade ago now, but still fairly much the same sorts of area. So back in the day, that was actually something novel. Now everyone and their dog. So platform for privacy preferences, P3P. These are a whole lot of codes that are used to dictate what you have built into your web page. Makes it simpler for a web developer to say who, what, where, when. It's a simple code that no one ever reads. So this is even worse than that 10-page document, making things difficult. A lot of pornographic sites will embed something like this, saying that they can take your information and sell it to whoever they want, because you then complain, but the reality is you've agreed to the practices, even though all you've seen is PXXY37, that sort of thing. So privacy legislation, there are various different aspects of legislation out there, and if you look at financial institutions, highly regulated, all evolving, all designed to protect people, etc., mainly from a reaction on the wrong side of things. Rather than having people take responsibility for their own data, we try and blame someone else. Is it against the law to dumpster dive an unlocked bin on the street? That one's actually interesting. If it's on the person's property, it's illegal. If they put it out on the street and it's unlocked, then it's legal. It's considered to have been destroyed. So where you dumpster dive makes a big difference. If you're going into a locked dumpster, then that's illegal. On the other hand, if it's an unlocked one on the person's property and you have to trespass to get it, that's illegal. But as soon as they wheel it out there to be picked up, and it's an unsecure one, it is fair game, yes. So you can go through someone's bins on the street legally. It's considered disposed. So, for instance, you could go out the front, and last night I've got a blue bin here, which is our paper recycling bin, and you could have gone through and had a look at all Craig's documents. Of course, I've actually got a shredder, so you'll only get my shredded documents, but, well, we do know you can spend enough time and effort and you can put those together. So different legislation, you'll need to know, Graham-Leach-Bliley Act, GLB, Fair Credit Reporting Act, know some of the different state regulations, such as California SB 1386. So question here. So port scanning is not illegal in Australia. Port scanning can be illegal anywhere. If you haven't authorized someone to access your server, then that's an illegal act. Whether you do anything out of it, that's a different issue. I wrote something a while back, legalities of port scanning, about 7 years ago. The problem is you're not going to be able to do anything against anyone. So it's illegal, but unless they cause damage, you're not going to actually get anyone to act on it. Now, for this for the certification, you need to go into US law, Australian law, and UK law. There's a little bit of Australian law because I'm an Australian, so when we wrote up the bits and pieces, and I wrote up the chapters for some of this, I chucked in Australian and British law and even some German and other bits and pieces. If it was written by an American, it would have just been American law. So comment here, but the server is open, it is unlocked. That doesn't matter. I can leave my front door open. It doesn't mean you have a right to walk in. People get that one mixed up. I have not set up a web server to invite you by putting a machine out there on the internet that isn't public. Just because you can try and port scan me doesn't mean you can legally port scan me. Just because I have things doesn't mean that they're there. So servers can be protected with a banner. Yes, that makes them a protected server, which is a big difference for American laws. So you need to understand things like SB 1386. 1386 means if there's a breach and it affects a Californian resident, then you have to notify everyone. That's a big issue because what is a Californian resident? People here in Australia can be breached and have implications under 1386 in California because I have a Californian resident, actually I've got two of them working for me. So if my company data was compromised, I have to go out there and ensure everyone knows. So we don't even know who they are. We have all these protections that we need to implement now because of the international nature of law. You need to understand personal information. So personally identifiable information or personal information, PI or PII, really comes down to anything that can really link you back to a particular user. Tax file numbers, social security numbers, employee medical benefits numbers, all of these sorts of things, all of this stuff that we can link back to say who I am. We also need to make sure that we don't rent or sell clients PI without letting them know and have contracts in place. Employees should not be discussing these things. Third parties shouldn't. So laws, we have many of them. So when we're talking about privacy, we have all these things like COPA, which is children under 13, the Canadian ones, the UK ones, EU privacy directives, Australian Privacy Amendment Act, the guidelines for protection of computer processed personal data in Japan, privacy ordinances, and Federal Data Protection Act of Germany. They're all the different ones you get to learn. So, investigation issues, you need to think about the time limits. That can be not just the legal jurisdictional issues, but how long information is kept for. It's no good if an ISP keeps information for a month, coming back 2 months later and going, can you get me? It's not going to be there. You need to find what is there and how it can go through, what you're able to use, how you can link it back to users, how you grab things like locational evidence, timestamp evidence, evidence lifecycle stuff, discovery, protection, recording, collecting, and tagging, making sure that it is there. Australia has a Cybercrime Act, that is correct. Some of them are better than others. And we need to make sure that we preserve it in such a way that we present it in a court of law. Australia has actually tested the Cybercrime Act. It's been used in a variety of different ways. We have actually done these things. I was an expert just about 6 weeks ago in a case up in Queensland for the Attorney Generals and Federal Police on the prosecution side. So yes, we've actually tested these things, and yes, the person got found guilty, luckily. Nasty case. But yes, all these things are there and have all already been tested. How well they actually work and all the rest, and whether I agree with all the provisions, is a different thing altogether. So evidence needs to be relevant. It needs to be related to the crime. I can say, I have evidence that my name is Craig Wright. But how does that relate to a crime that has been instigated that has nothing to do with me? It doesn't. So it needs to be relevant to the case at hand. It needs to be permissible, attained legally. It's no good if you have something that has been altered, made up, police haven't followed what they're meant to do, all that stuff. Reliability, not tampered with. No one has altered or changed or messed with or done anything else to our evidence. Reliability is important. Preservation, no damage, etc. And identification, we know what it is. So, at the end of the day, though, forensics is a little bit easier than some people think. Like we think about memory forensics and we sit there arguing, but it can change. Think forensics at the old way of being done. We had forensics a long time ago. Forensics has a history. Autopsies are a forensic thing. Just like any other scientific process, they follow a process. If the same person did the same thing, they would get about the same results. That's what we're looking at. You can't put the body back together afterwards. So the arguments you see from some people in IT saying, oh, well, if you do that, it won't be the same. Live forensics, you can't really use that because it's going to be different. So what? The court doesn't care about that. They care about the process. So, terminology. Forensics, the use of a scientific approach and technology to investigate and establish facts in an investigation. Computer fraud, obtaining something of value, computer, whatever else, and that you weren't meant to by some sort of deception. Securing the scene, this is protecting everything. Chain of custody, presenting evidence in a formal court proceeding. You need to prove how it was collected and ensure that you have not been able to manipulate things. Forensic investigation, we have intrusion detection systems may be involved, and it's really about reconstructing something so that we can see what actually occurred. Basically identifying, preserving and consolidating evidence of a crime or breach of policy. And that's an important difference. Not everything that we're going to have in court is a crime. A breach of contract, for instance, will still be able to be forensically investigated, but it may not be a crime. Who should perform it? Someone who is skilled in that particular area. So, need to have some idea of privacy, technical skills, understand the rules of evidence, etc. We also want to make sure our analyst understands how to capture and preserve evidence, how to report the facts, and they need to do this so that people can understand easily. Go to a barrister or an attorney or whatever else. And there are limitations. So we vent, discovery, analysis, decision, investigate, or not. So Thomas, some US states require that you have a private investigator's license to perform forensics. I hear this one all the time. The reality is not actually that. I know this one comes up. The reality is you don't need a private investigator's license. And I'll say that one again and again. For the simple fact that that would also entrap and capture everyone who presents as a chemist. As a chemist giving expert evidence, you don't need a PI license. So I know that one happens and people say it all the time, and I'll keep saying this, you don't. What you may need to do is have a PI license for certain types of investigation. But forensics and investigation are not the same thing. When you investigate a computer, you are not acting as an investigator. So, company that used Bitcoin miner in their product without telling the users, that could be fraud. It may not be. It would certainly be a breach of contract. So they may not be actually doing fraud, but they're doing theft of processing, theft of computer time, which is actually computer crime. So just because it's not fraud, not telling someone what they're doing may not be fraud, but it's definitely a theft of computer cycles, which is, if you've got a password and everything on your computer, a crime in the US and Australia anyway. So, anatomy of a forensic investigation. Get a complaint, document it. Assess and document. Seize evidence, document. Analyze data, document. Interview people, document. Assess facts, document. And write a report, and document. Notice there's one bit that we have to keep doing here. Document, 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 and document. One thing, if you want to get into computer forensics or digital forensics or any of this stuff, you need to be able to write, and write a lot. Report writing needs to occur. Fact-based. Only the facts, ma'am. You're putting down what happened first and foremost. All the activity, all relevant activity, good, bad, or whatever else. You, as a forensic investigator, are not working for your lawyer. You are working as an officer of the court. I know people get that one wrong all the time, but you are there to report to the court. That means what you're doing is good, bad, and indifferent. All the stuff that helps your case, all the stuff that goes against it. So, got some references here for this section. A little bit of reading. There's lots and lots of it. We'll put it up on the learning side, of course. So we've got lots of stuff on tools of the trade. So lots of these things. We also have ethics. Hard to define, as I've said. Certified professionals, you're meant to be held to a high standard, should be part of the organizational culture you're there, and you should have guidelines, but that's all they are. They're not anything more than guidelines. So, code of ethics, conduct accordance with moral standards, not be party to unlawful or unethical acts, report any unlawful acts, etc. Be professional. It's really about being professional at the end of the day. So, the CEI, Computer Ethics Institute, has a good set of thou shalts. These are the 10 commandments of computer ethics. Not use a computer to harm people. Not interfere with other people's work. Not snoop around in people's computer files. Not use a computer to steal. Not use a computer to bear false witness. Not copy or use proprietary software for which you have not paid. Not use other people's computer resources without authorization or the proper compensation. Pay if you're going to do it. So this number 7 here would be the Bitcoin miner one. It's unethical because they're using other computer resources without authorization or proper compensation. Not appropriate other people's intellectual output. Not say something's yours when you haven't written it. Not think about the social consequences of what you're writing. That doesn't mean you don't write it, but you sit there and you go, what could go right, wrong, or indifferent? And use a computer in ways that ensure consideration. It means you consider things. Doesn't mean you don't do it, once again, but you have to think about why. Internet Activities Board also has unacceptable and unethical activities, so things to think about there again. And remember, investigations, we're going to find more and more of these over time. So terms you need to know, you need to understand an event, which differs from an incident. An event is a negative occurrence. We don't know why. Incident, then we've investigated the event, and either it's just something that happened, or it's actually, well, something that is real, that actually has an impact. So, incident response, we need people from senior management, system administrators, security officers, public affairs, all sorts of things. We need to think of how this implements DR. Do we need to tick off disaster recovery when we're doing this? How does all that hang together? We need to think of the triage, reaction, and follow-up. Step 1, triage. What has been compromised? What is the extent? Reaction. Contain, analyze, track. So we need to think about that. What has gone right, wrong, or indifferent? How do we fix it? And how do we track where it's gone wrong? Then repair, recover, prevent. Part of all this, we want to make sure that we can go and put systems in place so that we don't suffer the same things again. collect evidence, try and find out what went wrong, and maybe we want to even take it to prosecute. Why or why not is something we might talk about on the forum, the discussion forum there. Forensics is a science of the recovery and analysis of electronic data. So digital forensics is the science for the recovery and analysis, things that are being presented in court. We can go through things like memory dumps to do it, duplicate of hard drives, etc. We should note what we're doing, evidence tags, and preserve and identify as we're going through it. We collect, examine, present, and make decisions. Where relevant, does it have a relationship to the findings? Is it legally permissible? Have we actually broken into someone else's computer to take this information? Are we doing it with a warrant if we're police? That sort of thing. So we have evidence type, best evidence and secondary evidence as an example, and also things like hearsay. So there's a bit of reading in this section. Being a legal section, like everything else in legal aspects of life, there's lots and lots of reading. And you also need to know the difference between enticement and entrapment. Big aspect of this is enticement are things like honeypots, where you try and entice people to use your server, where you try and get them to actually use your system so that you can see what they're doing bad. Entrapment, on the other hand, that's where law enforcement try and get you to actually be part of a crime that wouldn't have occurred otherwise. Only law enforcement can do entrapment. All right, first part, we're going to have a quick 2-minute break before we get back, or maybe 3-4 minute, where I'll talk and answer some questions before we get back into security practices part 2. So now, going over some of these things, you will need to know different legislation from different countries. You don't need to know it as a lawyer. Trust me, that takes a lot more time and effort. And also a different way of thinking. So there are a lot of requirements in all this. If you're going to want to be a lawyer, that means understanding some of this in different ways. Doesn't mean it's good, bad, or indifferent. It just means how you think as a lawyer or whatever else. So unfortunately, many of us don't understand from a legal point of view. From a legal point of view, what we're trying to do is have something presentable and able to be used in court, something that we can make sure that is admissible and all the rest. We're not generally thinking as a lawyer. We're not starting a case. We're not putting it in a way that suits our case, etc. And that's a whole different area. What this is trying to do with the CISSP is make this more professional. So just like lawyers are a profession, accountants are a profession, this is taking security people, IT security people, and making them professional. So how important is it to read about other laws, UK, US, AU, if you live in another country, Venezuela, where the laws might be applied differently? Okay. If you want to pass the exam, and this is 1/10 of what you're going to be tested on, then they're going to talk about all these different laws. Part of the issue comes down to how you apply laws internationally. Now, Venezuela has a whole lot of interesting ways of doing things. There are some interesting jurisdictional issues with Venezuela. I went there a number of years back because of some work for the Americans and whatever else, because in Venezuela, well, there are a whole lot of computer laws that apply to people in that country, but there's no extradition or anything with the US, so they apply in their own way. So it makes it, well, easy to be well, a computer criminal in Venezuela against the US, as long as you don't do it back against your own country, all these sort of funky things, so jurisdictional issues. But you need to understand international aspects of it. So just to clarify, for the PA license for forensics, you can do it for your own company employer without an issue. If you do it for a third-party contractor conducting a forensic investigation, trigger. But that's the terminology. You're using it wrong. You're not doing a forensic investigation. You are acting as an expert witness. So if you interview people during the course of the investigation, well, it's the terminology. You're mixing these things up. What I'll tell you is, Thomas, is you're using the terminology wrong. You're using it outside how a lawyer uses it. This is one of the difficulties. The state of art for a lawyer is very different from the state of art from the rest of how we generally speak. So what you say as investigation and all the rest, and what you're actually doing, is not what is seen as an investigation in court. So which 5 CA certs do you recommend? That depends where you are, Mick. How about I'll put that down on the forum. It's a bit much to type in here. But it's going to also vary depending on which you are. Which tools are used in forensics? Well, FTK, NCASE are quite common. Memory forensics, there's whole suites of these things. I personally like the sleuth kit. I'm old-fashioned and I like all these type in a computer type bits. I like actually having command line, but then I'm a dinosaur that way. But I find command line still works faster. Okay, so let's get back to this, going into part 2, security management practices, how to preserve critical business and all the rest again. And we're going to go over these things. CIA, really about protecting our information, security, governance, policies, information classification, and risk. I've got a nice big long document for a course structure I put together a number of years ago for risk management. Not short, but it'll go into the different areas to put together and what was learnt back then. It's quite good, if I say so myself, although the version there could be updated. Most of the stuff hasn't really changed that much. We also need to think about policies, procedures, and all the other bits to get governance in our organization. We have the normal confidentiality, only authorized subjects access to information, integrity, only authorized subjects modify information, and availability, ensuring that resources are there when we need it. But I will say we should be mainly thinking about reverse CIA and starting also thinking about it in a different way. Not just the normal aspects that we think, but also a little bit out of the box. Availability, preventing information and resources from being inaccessible when needed. Integrity, preventing unauthorized subjects from modifying information. And confidentiality, preventing unauthorized access. So allow and prevent and do it in the right way. We need both of those to integrate. So using it. How do we do this? So what are we trying to do? We want to reduce any problems, increase confidentiality. Does that mean we decrease availability? We've only got so much money. This is always a risk-based approach. So many resources, so much money, so much to do. We need to think about trade-offs. So threat, what is there? What is the threat and how does that impact our systems? If we increase one, do we decrease another? So that's something people don't always think about. If we want to make our system available, what does that really mean to everything else? CIA, once again, whoops, confidentiality, integrity, availability. Remember those. Confidentiality, integrity, availability. That's our CIA. If we increase one, we may decrease another. So we also need to think about security governance. This is key to any organization. Governance is the organizational process and relationships for managing risk. Policies, procedures, standards, guidelines, baselines, etc. Organizational structures, the roles, responsibilities, everything like that, so that the board can ensure that you have controls around the organization that work really well, so that you can ensure that everything is in place. So if we think about policy mapping, we have laws, regulations, requirements, organizational goals, objectives, the vision of our organization, general policies, everything goes down to functional policies. Gives us procedures, standards, guidelines, and baselines, all those things that our organization uses to keep control. So policies. Policies are a statement of management intention, the goals, etc. we're implementing. We require management support, senior management support at the end of the day to make security policies work. They're general high-level documents. They shouldn't be 20-page things detailing everything there. Things like acceptable use, internet access, logging, whatever else, they are a statement. Management says we will have logging on all systems. Is a policy. That's it. They should also be smart. This is specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, time-based. We need procedures. Procedures are then those things that map to our policy, that perform a specific task. So, decommissioning resources, we will wipe everything, go through it. This is how we wipe our hard drives, that sort of things. Adding user accounts, deleting accounts, etc. Procedures map to policies. We also have standards, which technologies we use, the operating systems, what we have in our configuration of our particular organization, guidelines, recommended methods, how we recommend we do things. Not hard and fast, but something that we can use to better analyze what we're doing, better get everything into place. And baselines, similar to standards, but account for differences in technologies, versions, etc. So when I implement whatever else here, I'll be at this level. So Windows 2008 server must be installed this way. Windows 8.1 must be installed this way, etc. We also need to think about the organizational restructure, whether we're looking at hierarchical versus project-based, functional matrices, whatever else, and how that ties together. So board of directors, CEO, committees, etc., all come in looking at our typical organizational chart. We can see how this ties together with things like a board of director and trustees, president or CEO, CIO, security director, etc., in a hierarchical approach. We can also look at splitting this out into a more security-orientated organizational chart where we split IT audit away from the security director so that we have some level of accountability between the two. If the security director, like we had before, has system auditor underneath them, then we don't have the accountability. Of course, here we still have the CIO controlling both areas, so then we can even make it more separated, especially if we're getting into larger organizations where we bring the audit committee, internal audit, whatever else, separate to even the CIO. So yes, separation of duties to thought collusion. Thank you, Paul. So this is what we're trying to do here. We're trying to make a level of accountability and trust so that the board of directors has oversight and can see what's happening in the organization. So should IT auditor come from security background or IT background or even accounting background? Yes, all of the above. Collect everything you need to know. What you need to have is an audit approach. Now, an accounting background will help you learn some of that, but you can learn IT first and then pick up an audit approach afterwards. One thing I will say is many pen testers make horrible auditors. And I'll also say this one, if you have a good audit process in place, that covers everything thoroughly without telling people we're going to audit this tomorrow, then that will outdo any pen test any day. The problem is we very rarely have good pen tests, we very rarely have good audits, which is a different issue. Okay, audit should be separate from implementation and operation. Independence needs to be set up so that we don't compromise it. We should also make sure that security is defined in job descriptions. And remember that senior management is the one that is ultimately responsible, not you, even as a security manager, for security. Functional responsibility is what we have as a security officer or management. When we're setting up roles, we need to think about best practices, least privilege, mandatory vacations, job rotation, and separation of duties. You'll see that we cover these things again and again throughout these courses. The roles and responsibilities need to be set. The owners, who we determine security requirements from, custodians, based on requirements, users, access allowed by security requirements, etc. So, and remember, not all information has the same value. Always risk-based. So we need to evaluate these things. So this is where we go back to our business impact analysis bit we talked about earlier. Look at the value of the information we're protecting. So value determines protection level. Protection determines procedures, and then we can look at labeling it to make sure that people know how to handle it. So information classifications, top secret, secret, whatever else. So we're looking at mandatory access controls, the other things we covered earlier in the access area. Then we can set up information classifications, or we can do that even in private sector with things like confidential, private, sensitive, public. So when we're classifying, we need to think about value. What is the value of this info? What is the age of it? 10 years down the track, information may not be worth as much. But if you're talking about the Coke formula or something like this, then it's still going to have value 20 years down the track. And that's based on the useful life, personal association, etc. So in risk management, we want to identify, evaluate, and all of this stuff. And it's not just a project. Risk management is an operational aspect of business. It's cyclic, continuous process. Need to understand what we have, and that's going to will change over time. So yes, audits take time and effort, interruptions and whatever else. So we need to make sure that we do have a process where audit can occur without causing us too much damage. Now, we need to understand in risk management the threats, the information, and the vulnerabilities, the gaps we have. To do this, we need to understand the assets we're protecting, the threats, whether they're man-made, natural, etc., the vulnerabilities and weaknesses in our system, and the controls, the safeguards that we put in place. We can do this two ways, quantitative or qualitative, or even a combination of both, where we're looking at quantitative, we're taking numerical values, looking at how much actual costs we have. Qualitative, subjective, I pick a number, and multiply it by a made-up number and get a made-up number. You might guess I'm not really a big fan of qualitative methods. Then we can think about how we remedy and mitigate risks. We can reduce it. We use controls to limit or reduce threats, remove it. We stop using a product, for instance. One example, if we keep saying that Adobe has too many problems, we can get a third-party product and move away and stop using Adobe. Transfer. Get insurance, outsource, blame someone else. And we can accept and hope for the best. CIA, remember, we have our CIA, or as I prefer, AIC triangle. Confidentiality, unauthorized disclosure, making sure that we have privacy over our data. Integrity, stopping unauthorized modification, ensuring that the data we have is correct. So examples, we have a trader supposed to sell one share for 610,000 yen or 5 grand or whatever it is at the moment. Instead sells 610,000 shares for 1 yen each, etc., and screws up and makes a big difference. So is risk management we discuss here only covering the IT security part of it? Well, it's the IT security assets. So it's going to cross over with finance and operations, but we're in particular looking at the IT security part of it. So not so much someone walking out with a piece of paper, but it could be. Generally, information systems risk. So, integrity, we can use hashes or whatever else, birthday attacks and everything we covered in crypto, an area you need to remember. Availability, making sure our system is going to be there when we want it. only authorized parties, and when authorized parties can access, etc. So do we have to know the International Risk Standard ISO 31000? No, but it won't hurt you. So if you do know that, you don't, it won't hurt you, but it covers many of these things, so it's not going to hurt. At the end of the day, if you want to go into some of the ISACA, ISACA, like CISA or CISSP type qualifications, or their governance one, then you'll need to know ISO 31000. So we can attack availability, taking down power grids, DOS attacks, all sorts of things. Also need to think about how these work within general management. We need to manage risk management, policies, procedures, and build from all of this a security program that enables us to operate over time. So it's a circular process, and it really comes back to making sure that we manage risk over time. Management is the one ultimately responsible, not the administrator, not the security guy. Management. Let me say this again and again, and I'll hype over this. Management are responsible for working. So management must lead and direct the programs if we want them to be successful. So top down, the ultimate goal is to approach through ensuring that governance is in place. So bottom-up approach is going to generally fail because we don't have the authority or the budgets or anything else to actually run these things correctly. So we need to have it from the top down. And again, management, direct security, the owner of a system, not the functional owner, the actual owner is the one who tells you what you have in place. So security controls, we have administrative, technical, physical, and whatever else controls, and we need to think about how they work within our organization. We have functional controls, evaluating functional assurance requirements. Do they actually do the required tasks, or do we have enough protection to think about? And let's go through some terms. So vulnerability, unpatched application, open modems, whatever else, it's a procedural weakness, and the key being procedural weakness that provides an attacker the opportunity to obtain an unauthorized access. It is different than a flaw. So we can have a flawed system that is vulnerable and a flawed system that is not vulnerable, depending on how we have set it up. We can have a flaw that is not vulnerable because it's firewalled, for instance, and you can't get to the flaw. So a threat is a natural or man-made event that could have some negative impact on the organization, whether this is a hurricane, a fire, a criminal hacker, whatever else, it doesn't matter. These are threats that have a potential to cause an impact or damage. So, natural person is our threat agent. A threat agent is that person that takes advantage of the vulnerability. At the end of the day, there is always a person somewhere involved. Although we might have bot zombies, networks out there scanning actively all by themselves, it is the threat agent is always the person behind that. There is no Skynet, there is no nothing else sitting there all by its own, taking over the earth. There is a threat agent always behind these things. And the risk is then the probabilistic calculation, the likelihood of a threat agent taking advantage of that vulnerability, the exposed weakness, and causing some damage or impact. So risk really is the glue tying vulnerability, threat, and likelihood together. So exposure, you can be exposed from losses without having losses. Now, if, for instance, you have an unpatched web server running out there, you are exposed. You may not ever be compromised. You may really be lucky, which I doubt. Eventually these days you'll be found. But you could be attacked, and that's exposure. So countermeasures, these are the controls we put in place to mitigate as much as possible a potential risk, remembering there is no absolutes in security. None. Basically, I'll tell you there's no absolutes in reality. The only one I'll say for the moment is the speed of light in a vacuum, and who knows on that one. Even the old absolute zero has been proven to be wrong because earlier this year scientists released an experiment showing negative temperatures, negative Kelvin. So if you can create a negative temperature system going below absolute zero, then yeah, too bad. So we have countermeasures and safeguards to try and help us be as secure as is viable. We have to think about how our organization goes about it. We use models and frameworks for this. These are those things like processes and whatever else that help us support the end goal. Each company will then have its own methods, own methodologies, multiple layers, multiple goals, and whatever else. Operational goals, technical goals, and strategic goals. Operational goals are daily things, the short-term stuff that you work on each and every day. Tactical goals, mid-term, creating something like wanting to implement NAP, Network Access Protection, so that your Windows domain is more secure. And strategic goals are the long-term objectives. On top of that, it's a life cycle process. Remember this. Plan, organize, implement, operate, monitor, start again. Learn, improve, learn, improve, learn, improve. And we need to think also business and military are not the same. We see too much out there all the time saying protect confidentiality, protect confidentiality. Well, we're more concerned generally in the business world with actually having a business. It will vary. Some private sector companies will care more about the confidentiality and aspects of your business. You can't say everything is about availability. It comes down to the business impact analysis bit. What matters most, and ensuring that that's in place. We have information risk management processes, remembering no perfect security. We then think about what risk we have, how we can mitigate them, countermeasures, firewalls, or transferring insurance. What are risks? Physical damage, human, equipment malfunction. I've had a computer actually burst into flame before. Not a common occurrence. I've had that happen once in the 20 years that I've had data centers that I've been running and things like this. But back in 1998, I had a compact machine where it still had a floppy drive, and the floppy drive burst into flame. No, I wasn't typing too fast, but the floppy drive died for some reason. Something happened and the motor shorted, and it actually started burning. Luckily, it didn't take out the whole machine. We could save the hard drives and move it off, but things happen. So equipment malfunctions. There are a number of Apple machines that melted down, battery failures, etc. Application errors, poor coding, bugs, computational errors, all that stuff are risks. Risks need to be identified, classified, and analyzed. We need to know what they are before we can react to them. And we can never measure everything. We can get a good probability. There's no absolutes in all of this. What we can have is a risk range. So we can say we're 95% confident that our risk is between X and Y. It's a great thing for statistical tools. We can, if we get people to understand statistical tools and confidence intervals, we can start going, oh, we're 95% confidence level that we're going to lose between $10 and $11 million. We're 99% confident we're going to lose between $1 and $20 million, that sort of thing. So risk is not completely measurable, but we can get a good idea for our particular system. We do this by identifying our assets, the business impact analysis part we did earlier, finding the vulnerabilities and threats. That's why we do things, or should be doing things like vulnerability analyses, why we're trying to do things such as pen testing. We're trying to find the vulnerabilities and threats that could be there. We want to then guess or calculate the probability of damage, cost of damage, what it could mean for my organization. And there's no one tool that will give us all of this, because it varies based on what your organization has put in place, what your data is worth to you. We need to put cost-effective countermeasures in place, and that is our goal, to be cost-effective. So management, again, are responsible for this. Management, you need to understand that management are the ones responsible for risk. Do that and you'll do well in the exam. Management can delegate data custodians and business units some of the risk, but they're still the responsible party. Value can be done quantitatively and qualitatively. Organizations can say, this is the most important project, this is the next important whatever else. They can do it that way, in a qualitative way. Or they can say, this is what it's worth. Depends on the types of organizations, quantitative and qualitative. Quantitative is where we put a number down. Qualitative is where we will basically rank things. Now, the document that will be loaded there goes into a lot of detail on each of those and a whole lot of different strategies for it. Quantitative, asset value, threat frequency, probability of incidents, and whatever else. This is where a lot of my work and research comes into it. I like putting numbers on things. I'm a statistician in heart as well as everything else, and I have qualifications in finance and statistics as well as IT security and law, so I like putting numbers on things. It's really going to be impossible to have a pure exact number in any risk. What we're doing, even in insurance calculations and whatever else, is getting a range of values, somewhere between this and that, and that gives us a statistical model that we can put in place. We can automate some of that, and well, it gives us an idea of what our cost is. Other than doing that, because one of the reasons we don't do it is it's expensive. Going through our whole organization and putting all these things down can be quite expensive. Is qualitative. So we can put a qualitative risk analysis, looking at judgment, best practice, intuition, experience, and saying, oh, I think this is more problematic than the other. But at the end of the day, we need a security policy in place. It needs to be generic. We're not going to say we must use Windows 8. It should be we have secured computers. That's a policy statement. How we secure them then comes down into other documents, but we need something as generic as we will have secured computers. Gives us our mission statement for security and the objectives of the business, and it needs to incorporate the entire business. It really needs to be must type stuff, non-technical, forward-thinking, and it needs to be dated and version controlled, so we update this or review it all the time. And it can come into regulatory, advisory, and informative types. So depending on the type of organization you're with, once again. Now, standards within organizations are mandatory things. All employees must wear their company ID, etc. It's something everyone needs to do. A baseline, minimum levels of protection. You will have antivirus, but we don't care which type, whether it's updated, whatever else. The baseline is we install all systems running the latest version of Windows with antivirus and patched, that sort of thing. Guidelines, these are the recommended areas. They're gray areas, allowing you to guesstimate some responses but not have everything covered. And procedures are the step-by-step tasks. These are external to policies. How you install the operating system, how you patch things, whatever else. And there'll be different levels of procedures, right up for high-level ones saying that more like a policy, down to low-level procedures. And we've already had this argument a little bit on the forum. We need to understand two terms very well, due diligence and due care. Okay, so that one's been addressed on the forum, and have a bit of a read. Some good answers. Data owner, member of the management in charge of a business unit or similar, responsible for their data. responsible for determining what's in place and what they need to protect, the value that we're going to assign. Data custodian is the person who maintains the day-to-day operation of that data, the backups, the integrity, restoring data, all that stuff, and even security operations. The system owner is the person who owns the system, not the information on it. So we need to also integrate what we're doing between a system owner and the data owner to ensure that we have the right systems in place. We have a security administrator. This is the person who defines what is set up. Now, as a firewall administrator, for instance, your job is not to make a perfectly secure firewall, contrary to what some people think. As terrible as it may sound, your job is to implement the system that the business has signed off on. Your job will also be letting them know the true risk. And if they say, yes, that's risky, we understand, and we're going to do it anyway, then live with it. That's what it's there for. Just document why. Make sure that they know that it sucks. And security analyst is not implementation. It's a strategic looking at things role. Many people get these mixed up, and it is bad. You should have separation here. Security administrator and security analyst are separate roles. The administrator is the day-to-day actually doing stuff, and the analyst is the strategic why we're doing it consulting part. They should be different. Application owner, the person who owns the application, the web server, whatever else, the database. The supervisor, HR, the person managing employees, all of that stuff also has their role. The data analyst, how you set up your database, what you put in place, all that stuff. Process owner, hiring process, fulfillment processes, lots of stuff to understand here. And then we get to the user, the person day-to-day who accomplishes all those work tasks and business objectives. So we need to make sure that IT is user-friendly. We have issues if we don't, because psychological problems of security. If we make something that is not psychologically acceptable to our users, then they're going to find ways around it. And we have auditors to make sure we're doing things correctly. These are someone who should be independent, even if they're in our organization, that can validate whether we're doing things correctly. Should be third party. That can be third party in the organization, a separate hierarchy, or external auditors where we bring in someone from outside. Reason for this is separation of duties. So we want to make sure that someone can't do a critical task by themselves. They can't enter the bank account details and pay it. They can't do all that stuff. So requiring collusion to do a task that is bad means at least two people or more need to work together to do a negative action. So we should also think about hiring practices, making sure we have the right employees, the right culture, the right everything else, that we have non-disclosure, that we have done education checks, that we have done reference checks. My education checks are nice and simple. I got sick of people bitching about how I couldn't have certain things, so I blogged them all. So you can go over to my blog and you'll find copies of all my degrees and all sorts of stuff if you want to look through them and see what my education actually is, if you want to trawl through my several thousand pages of my blog. Rotation of duties. We need to make sure we rotate duties. One, redundancy. First of all, making sure we have multiple skilled people in case something happens, which is reducing risk in itself, and also to ensure that people don't gain too much control. This is why also we want mandatory vacations, ensuring people leave so that we can not have fraud. Split knowledge, separation of duties once again, half a bank vault combination, half the password, half whatever else, and dual control, but multiple people separated, turned at the same time. It's the old fire the nuke type scenario where both people at the same time need to do something. Okay, so we have all of these together. Also need to think about how we terminate employees if we need to surrender IT badges, walk people, all of that stuff. So security management is how we do the day-to-day management of all these processes, how we handle risk over time, how we really pull together our organization and make it work over the long term. And it's not just a project, it's operational. Okay, so that's it for week number 3. Any quick questions? Or we've got the forum, of course, to keep going and typing away. And hope you enjoyed and learnt. Yes, unfortunately I can't answer for GoToMeeting there. It is being recorded. Hopefully nothing too crackly in the background or anything like that on the recording. I'm not a big fan of GoToMeeting, but that's life. All right. Yes, there's always a lot to pile into all a very short time with these things. Alrighty, so I'll call it an afternoon for this one here, and let you get back to things. Great to have had you come along, and I'll catch you all again next week or on the forum. Have a great afternoon.